Roman bondage, voodoo Macbeth, and the weird legacy of Bunga Bunga. All that and more on this bonus episode of Our Fake History. Roll the bonus theme. Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. But on these bonus episodes, I like to take questions from my amazing listeners and answer them as best I can. Now, it's been a minute since we've done a bonus episode, so on today's show, I am going to be answering questions about the last 3 topics that we have covered on Our Fake History. On episode number 249, we looked at the issue of Roman slavery with Dr. Emma Southern. Then on episode 250, we talked about the curse of the Shakespeare play Macbeth. Then, finally, on the most recent episode, number 251, we explored the audacious prank known as the Dreadnought Hoax, which involved Britain's most famous warship in 1910 and a group of ridiculous upper-crust hoaxers, including Virginia Woolf. Now, obviously, these were 3 very different episodes, but what I liked about this run of 3 is that it demonstrated the breadth of our fake history. Now, if you've been listening for a while, then you've probably noticed that I've had to stretch the definition of what counts as fake history. When I began this show, the parameters were very simple. I was exploring historical myths, those stories that had been wrapped into the historical record which probably weren't true. But over the years, I've tried to make my understanding of what counts as fake history a little bit more elastic. This has just been so I can talk about more stuff and explore more interesting stories on the show. So now I also deal with historical misconceptions, historical controversies. I love famous fakes and famous hoaxes, and generally things that we get wrong about the past. Now, I'm very conscious that I can only push this stuff so far before people will start going, wait, what is this show anymore? Is this even about fake history? I get it. I am conscious of that. I am aware of it. Every time I approach a new topic, I'm always thinking, what is the fake history angle here? What is the historical myth I am busting? Or what type of misconception am I addressing in this show? Now that I'm 11 years deep, I have exhausted many of the most obvious historical myths and misconceptions that are out there, but not all of them. And one of the things I have learned on this journey is that almost every single historical event is in some way contested or has given birth to some kind of a myth. Luckily for us, human history is as broad as it is deep, so I'm not too worried about running out of things to talk about on the show. So, once again, I just want to thank you for coming on this journey with me and indulging me as I've expanded the parameters of our fake history so we can tell more weird and entertaining stories from the past. Okay, let's get into your questions. Our first question comes to us from Damien on Patreon. This is just a reminder that I always go to Patreon first when I am looking for questions for these bonus shows. If you want to be a patron, go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Damien's question has to do with slavery in the Roman Empire. He asks, I have a possibly easy question. Did the transition from republic to empire have any impact at all on the institution of slavery? Thanks for that question, Damien. Now, this was an interesting one because, believe it or not, I actually asked Dr. Emma Southon something along these lines when I did my interview with her. But I ended up cutting that question and her answer out of the final show. And here's why I cut it out. She basically said, no, the transition from republic to empire didn't have a serious impact on the institution of slavery in Rome. I chose to cut that question because I found the answer to be not particularly illuminating, and we covered many of the other things that she addressed in her answer at other points on the show. Now, while the institution of slavery did not change when Rome went from being a republic to an empire, I think you could say that the influx of slaves contributed to Rome's transition from republic to empire. Now, there are many reasons why the Roman Republic was eventually supplanted by a more autocratic system that we call the empire, which was headed by a single emperor with quite a lot of power. One of the reasons has to do with the huge amounts of wealth that were flowing into Rome and into the hands of a select group of people. There was a small elite class who was benefiting considerably more from Rome's expansion than the rest of the population. These super elite Romans who would end up fighting each other in the civil wars were also Rome's biggest slaveholders. For instance, if we just look at the rise of a figure like Julius Caesar, one of the key steps towards him becoming dictator for life and setting the groundwork for what would become the emperor were his conquests in Gaul, in what is today France and the Netherlands and that whole part of Europe. The conquests in Gaul sent not only a lot of material wealth back to Rome, but thousands upon thousands of human beings who had been taken as slaves. So you could make the argument that the personal power and prestige of a person like Julius Caesar was deeply connected to his role in the slave trade. So in this way, the growth of slavery sort of mirrored the decline of the republican system. The more wealth and slaves that were being brought in by the expansion of the empire, the harder it was to maintain what had been the existing political order. Individuals like Caesar and Pompey, who were out there enslaving huge chunks of the European population, would eventually be doing battle for control of Rome. But it seems like the day-to-day existence of an enslaved person did not change all that much from the Republican era into the early Empire era, at least according to Dr. Southon. Our next question concerning the episode on Roman slavery comes to us from Cole on Patreon. Cole writes, "Hey, loved the chat. You two discussed how Roman historians were quite moralizing in their history writing. I think moralizing historians are a common theme across history and have come up on the show. See the Victorians. My first question is that I feel like history was taught pretty amorally when I was in school compared to other points of history. I graduated high school in 2015 for context. As a teacher, do you feel this is true, or is it just my personal bias because those lessons aligned with my moral worldview? Secondly, can and should we be teaching history without moral lessons? Curious what you think from your teaching experience. Love the show, and I look forward to each new episode drop. Thanks." Cole, this is a fascinating question, and one that I thought about all the time when I was teaching full-time, and one that I continue to think about as I create this podcast. Should the teaching of history have a moral component? Well, one thing that the ancient historians would do was fit the events of the past into a very specific, prescribed moral framework. And when a moment from the past did not fit within that framework, they would either explain it away, ignore it, or they would come up with invented details to help it fit within a moral framework. The ancient Roman historians would also do things like create long speeches and put them in the mouths of historical figures specifically to teach moral lessons. So that is a trope of historical history writing that I don't think we need to bring back. We don't need to pretend that ancient figures or any figure from the past said something that they didn't actually say. Nor should we change the facts of the past to fit within a particular moral framework. We should be crystal clear about what there is evidence of and what there is not evidence of. I believe when we teach history, we should be clear-eyed and honest about what happened. However, that does not then prescribe how we should feel about those things. I do believe that in the world of history education, there should be a lot of room for individual students to make up their own minds about whether or not a historical event was a good thing or a bad thing or an evil thing or a triumphant thing. The issue becomes when things are not allowed to be taught because they might make a certain nation or certain powerful people or a certain ideology look bad. The facts are the facts, and students should be exposed to them. With that said, there are certain issues where I don't think it's wrong to give a certain amount of moral guidance to your students. For instance, if you're teaching about any one of history's many atrocities, and as a teacher, you just sort of shrug your shoulders at it and go, hey, you kids make up your own mind if this was a good thing or a bad thing, I think that can give the wrong impression to students. That suggests that being like, oh yeah, maybe this atrocity was all right, is a morally justifiable position. So when we're teaching history, I think it's all right to sort of create some moral boundaries around our teaching, but to be also very clear about what they are. Try to be extremely explicit to your students and say, like, you know, this class values human rights. That was something that I used to say, that human rights are a value that I have, is something that I care about, and that in this classroom, the idea that every human being has certain inalienable rights is going to be baked into the cake of how we teach this history and how you will be learning about this history. Now, thankfully, that was not a particularly controversial position to take while I was teaching. It's interesting you say you graduated in 2015. That means that you could have been one of my high school students. But I think by simply staking out that ground, I was creating a moral framework, and I was teaching from that position. So I just think it's impossible to completely purge yourself of bias, to completely, teach entirely objectively. I don't think human beings can actually do that. And by doing that, you might give the impression that certain horrendous acts are morally neutral. And I don't believe that is true. But personally, in the classroom, I tried to do what I do on this podcast, which is tell you what my biases are when they are relevant, try to check myself and make sure my biases are not getting in the way. Or if I feel like it's a story where I need to stake out some moral ground, let's say, I'm very clear about it. I lay it out. I make it very obvious what my opinions are and where my moral stances are. Now, I find it interesting that you believe that you were taught history in an amoral kind of way. Now, I don't know where you grew up. I don't know where you went to high school. You may have had a wonderfully objective set of history teachers. But my instincts tell me that you were not taught history in a totally amoral way. I believe that you were probably taught history in a way that reflected the values of the society in which you grew up. You were told stories which reinforced those values in a way that was not so overbearing that you noticed them. You see, every history textbook that's ever been written, even the very good ones, have a narrative that they are trying to communicate about history. So even if your teachers just stuck to whatever textbook they had been given, they were then teaching that narrative, even if they weren't consciously thinking about it. So I think the most important thing to remember is that these narratives are everywhere. They are being constructed, and we just have to think about them critically. It doesn't even mean that the narratives are always wrong. It just means that even the right narratives are being built, because to create a story out of the wild, diverse reality of experience, it requires editing, it requires selection, and it is necessarily guided by values. So all of this is to say that, yes, we should use our understanding of morality to guide our interpretation of history. However, we should not use our understanding of morality to edit our history. Those are my thoughts on that one. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Shopify. Picture this, it's late at night and you're scrolling through your feeds when all of a sudden you see it, that one product that you've been looking for. You click the link, add to cart, maybe even shop around a little more before finally hitting checkout. As you're filling in your address, you realize you don't have your card anywhere near you. That's when you see it. That purple pay button that has all of your information saved, making checking out as simple as a tap on your screen. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. With Shopify, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. You can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. See less carts go abandoned and more sales go with Shopify and their Shop Pay button. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/fake. Go to shopify.com/fake. That's shopify.com/fake. Let's move on to some questions about Macbeth and the curse that allegedly haunts that play. Now, I got an amazing and lengthy email from a patron named Stephen, and I want to share some big chunks of it. Now, Stephen also helps answer a few of our other patrons' questions here. So I'm going to start with the first chunk of Stephen's email, then we'll hear some other questions, and then we will return to Stephen's email to help answer some of the queries that came from other curious listeners. All right, Stephen writes, "You know I love you and our fake history. Like an Orson Welles movie, what's not to love? Speaking of Orson Welles, one of the most famous The Curse of the Scottish Play stories was perpetuated by him, helping its spookydom spread even further. On the verge of his break in Hollywood with his masterpiece Citizen Kane, Welles directed a seminal version of the play in 1936 for the Federal Theater Project, part of the Workers' Project administration of FDR's New Deal, that later became a victim of the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings about communist activities in the United States. Welles set his version of Mackers during the Haiti slave revolt, using a slave-turned-king, Henri Christophe, as the model for the title character. Theatergoers were stunned with an all-black cast on Broadway, and the show later toured the country. The entire run was sold out, and the performance is a great landmark in theater history, not just in terms of casting, but also an early entry into setting Shakespeare's works in different times and places, and the hardcore, realistic acting style Welles introduced in his early movies. Dubbed Voodoo Macbeth, Welles hired musicians versed in African voodoo rituals and so-called witch doctors from Sierra Leone. Due to scheduling conflicts, the 150-member cast began their rehearsals at midnight, continuing through the witching hours until daybreak. Race issues, acting style, and the size of the show caused some notable critics to give poor reviews. That's where the Scottish play curse comes in. Percy Hammond of the Herald Tribune was one of those critics who panned the show. In response, it was reported that the drummers met in the theater following a performance. Rumor has it that a live chicken was brought into the space, but never left. As Orson Welles later tells the story, one drummer had offered to, quote, make Berry Berry on this bad man. He told the story that a voodoo doll was created in Hammond's effigy and stuck with pins. Welles states that he found this funny until just a few days later, Percy Hammond died. Ah, that old dark magic. Now, Stephen's email goes on from there, but wow, I had heard of the so-called Voodoo Macbeth. It came up in the research that I was doing for this show. However, I did not come across the story that a well-known theater critic was dispatched via voodoo doll. Now, once again, this sounds like more theater lore, and Welles himself was a notorious myth maker. He was known to fudge the facts to make a better story. But honestly, this version of Macbeth sounds awesome. And my suspicion is that the critics of the day just weren't ready for the unorthodox approach that they brought to the material. I, for one, am not a purist when it comes to Shakespeare. I think that if we want these plays to remain vital, we need to be constantly reimagining them. And that's the beauty of art. We can take things, we can mess with them, we can twist them around. And it's cool to know that Orson Welles and his all-black cast were at the forefront of this in the 1930s. I'm really glad that Stephen shared this story because it's clear that this Orson Welles production was a key part of the growth of the Scottish play curse mythos. And unfortunately, I did not address it on the main podcast, so I'm glad we were able to talk about it here. Our next question comes to us from Rachel on Patreon. Rachel writes, I've heard that one of the reasons Mackers seems cursed is that it's the most difficult play from a technical standpoint, which means that more can go wrong. Did you come across this in your research as well? Is there any truth to that? All right, Rachel, good question. Yes, I did come across this. Now, it's not that Macbeth is the most difficult play that one can perform. There are certainly many more modern plays that have more special effects or more complicated stage directions or things like that that make them objectively harder to do. Now, Macbeth does involve a lot of stage combat and some special effects that are usually employed during the scenes with the witches. But this does not make Macbeth all that much more technically challenging than many other plays that were written in the 1600s. On-stage special effects were quite common in the so-called gunpowder plays, which were written in the wake of the gunpowder plot. In the episode, I made reference to a contemporary play where demons were being summoned on stage, and one would come on stage riding something that looked like a dragon. Anyone that knows their Shakespeare can also tell you that stage combat is incredibly common in his plays. Macbeth is certainly not the only Shakespeare play with sword fights. But Macbeth does have some big ones, and anytime you have stage combat, you are going to run the risk of injury. It seems to me that once the idea of the Curse of Macbeth got established in the early 20th century, any injury that happened during the run of the play got chalked up to the curse. Those injuries tended to be better remembered and tended to be talked about more. But as soon as you look at the production history of any play, you will quickly discover that there are many stories of calamity and injury that occurred, especially in plays that have stage combat. And to help prove this point, I'm going to turn it back to our man Steven and his super long email. He writes, "The other thing I wanted to note about cursed plays, in my almost 40 years in theater, the real cursed play, in my opinion, is Romeo and Juliet. Maybe it's the intense sword fight in Act 3, Scene 1 that sets itself up for tragedy. Every production I've been involved with involves emergency room action. Juliet tripping on the scenery and spraining her ankle. Romeo's nose busted open on stage and bleeding profusely. Atlanta staged the ballet version years ago. During one performance, an actor's chest plate slipped beneath his costume, and he was actually stabbed on stage. But I was the backstage manager during what is likely the worst theater story you'll ever hear. You could do a whole Our Fake History episode on this one performance. The last show of the season at the Illinois Shakespeare Festival, a mediocre Romeo and Juliet was actually exceptional. Might have been the heat lightning going off above the outdoor venue or just closing night magic. Granted, someone's sword broke in two and hit the feet of the wife of the season's biggest sponsor, the man who paid for the patron trip to London. Still, the show was amazing as it had never been before. But at the top of Act 3, where the big fight scene happens, there was a literal bath of blood. Outdoor summer theater is full of sweaty actors. Perhaps this is why Benvolio lost control of his knife. Lee Harvey Oswald's magic bullet had nothing on this dagger. The knife, blunted for stage combat, but still dangerous when something goes wrong, hit Romeo in the face, lacerated his lip over an inch, and knocked out 6 teeth, 3 of which were permanently lost. The actor still wears dentures and has an incredible scar on his cheek. The dagger continued and hit another actor in the temple, causing more blood. But it wasn't done. The knife ricocheted and hit a British lady in the face, breaking her glasses but leaving her uninjured. The stage was evacuated of bodies so quickly that the stage manager over the headset mumbled, what just happened? Empty stage except for one person, Benvolio. He collapsed on Juliet's bed, hidden in a below space in view of the audience, and proceeded to wail a mournful, unearthly wail of pain and horror. My great contribution, I poked out and closed the curtain on the bed. That way the audience couldn't see him, only hear his banshee cry keening through the dark August night. And no, the show did not go on. They are staging Romeo and Juliet at the same theater this summer. I think I'll instead get me to a nunnery. And he's got more for us here too, friends. I'm just going to keep going because this is an amazing email. Decades later, one of the actors in that show told me that he'd gone to New York City and was hanging out after the show with actors in a Broadway play. We always share theater stories, and someone began, "Hey, you guys know Robert? He was playing Romeo in this show in Illinois," and my friend stopped them. "Sorry, that's actually my story. I was there," and he related his version of the tragedy. So, an entire group of actors 1,000 miles and 20 years away were perpetuating a story which evidently is lore in backstages across the globe. Just goes to show, you've got your memes, your pseudoscience, your fake news, and truth socials, but if you want a real piece of dramatic history with all the smoke, mirrors, and daggers, just ask a theater person to tell you a story about their time on stage. Love the show. Love you. Thanks for leading the charge to live your dreams. Steven, I love you too, man. That is an amazing story. But I think his point is clear, right? I bet if we went back and looked at the production history of Romeo and Juliet and added up all the crazy things that happened on stage, it would be easy to make the case that that play was actually the one with the curse on it. But, of course, that's just not how the mythology unfolded. Wow. Stephen, thanks again. I know that was an epic email, but man, I thought everyone would enjoy hearing that story. All right, we've got one more question about the Scottish play. This one comes from Beth on Patreon. Beth writes, "More of a statement than a question. Yes, I work in higher education, but please don't undersell the mild snark of season 1 of Our Fake History. Would I listen to a longer, more nuanced version of the Shakespeare episode? Yes, but sometimes there needs to be a bit of snark. See Lying Sex Witch." Hey, Beth, don't worry. The snark's not going anywhere. She continues, "And now an actual question. I have not seen or heard of this curse transferring to the movie sets. I'm thinking of Denzel Washington's film from 2021, but I know there have been others. Is the curse a stage-specific belief or any production? Thanks as always for all you do." Thanks so much for that question, Beth. So, those who believe in the curse believe that you should not say Macbeth in a theater, especially when you are not actively performing the play. The one time it's all right to say Macbeth is if you are performing Macbeth and it is one of the lines in the play. But it's funny that you bring up the Denzel Washington film from 2021. You see, during the Oscars that year, Chris Rock was on stage, and before he made his fateful joke about Jada Pinkett Smith, he congratulated Denzel Washington on his performance in Macbeth, thus uttering the word Macbeth inside of a theater. And then just moments later, he was slapped across the face by Will Smith. Was this once again the curse of Macbeth? I mean, I don't know. I don't really think so. But I love that that's out there. People believe that the infamous slap that happened between Chris Rock and Will Smith occurred because of the curse of Macbeth. So chew on that one. All right, now let's take a couple questions about the most recent episode on the Dreadnought hoax. This next question comes from Andre. Andre writes, "Excellent episode. I have 2 questions. Do you know if the German press reported on it and what was their take? I'm wondering if the lack of repercussions was also an effort to diminish its perceived impact on the Germans." And the next question, The hoaxers were not officially punished, were the Navy members. Thanks for the questions, Andre. Now, I was not able to find any German press reports that had been translated into English about this particular event. That is a great question because we know how the British reported on the Captain of Köpenick scam. Longtime fans might remember that a few seasons back, we looked at the story of the man in Germany who dressed up as a fake military captain and robbed a small town hall outside of Berlin while impersonating an officer. Now, interestingly, when the Dreadnought hoax happened, many of the British newspapers immediately compared it to the Captain of Köpenick imposture. Now, I hope one day to compare these two things because the press at the time did perceive these two scams, pranks, hoaxes, whatever you want to call them, as two sides of the same coin. But sadly, I was not able to see how the German press reported on the Dreadnought hoax. German listeners, if you want to get into the newspaper archives and do some translating for me, I'd love to know. I have a feeling that the German papers probably loved it in the same way that the British papers loved the story of the Captain of Köpenick. As for the second part of your question, no one in the Navy was punished. The most severe punishment that turned up in my research was a dressing down that Admiral May gave to one of the officers on the Dreadnought who said that he thought that one of the people that came aboard was wearing a false beard. Specifically, he thought the beard on Adrian Stephen, who was playing the German translator, looked a little fake. And Admiral May was so annoyed that this man didn't say anything at the time. But as I said on the episode, the rules of decorum were such that trying to call someone out for wearing a fake beard in that moment would have been incredibly impolite, and you would not have wanted to be wrong. So I understand why that particular officer kept his mouth shut. All right, this next question comes to us from Alex on Patreon, and just a word of warning, this question deals with some sexual content, so if you are listening with younger people and you do not want them exposed to that, you may want to skip ahead or just end the episode here. I promise not to be explicit, but I just thought I'd give everyone listening a heads up. Alex writes, former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi famously hosted sex parties that were popularly referred to as Bunga parties. Is there any connection between this phrase and the use of Bunga in the Dreadnought hoax? All right, thanks for that question, Alex. So, for those who do not know, Silvio Berlusconi was Prime Minister of Italy on 3 separate occasions. He was Prime Minister from May 1994 to January 1995. Then his longest tenure from June 2001 to May 2006. And then he was Prime Minister again from May 2008 to November 2011. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I've got an incredible grasp on all the nuances of Italian politics, but I can tell you this. To me, Silvio Berlusconi seemed like a particularly corrupt and disgusting politician. I know, hot takes. You didn't expect hot Italian political takes today on Our Fake History, but let it be known that Our Fake History is anti-Silvio Berlusconi. Anyway, one of the many scandals which plagued Berlusconi's time as prime minister involved these illicit parties which happened at his properties that were very Epstein-esque, quite frankly. You can go find out all the details about this stuff if you are curious. But what concerns us is that apparently these gatherings were called Bunga parties. Now, I did some research and I discovered that these parties got their name from a dirty joke that was told to Berlusconi, allegedly, by former Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Yes, apparently Gaddafi had a joke that he loved telling where the punchline was, "You will be killed by Bunga Bunga," which basically was like death by sex, if I'm understanding the joke correctly. I've never heard this one before. It sounds kind of gross, and honestly, sounds pretty racist. So there isn't a direct connection between the Dreadnought hoax and the term Bunga Bunga and Berlusconi's Bunga Bunga parties, other than the phrase Bunga Bunga became a stand-in for like mock African language. Apparently, Gaddafi's joke involved an African tribe or something. So if we want to connect the dots, Bunga Bunga becomes a way to mock African languages. It then gets incorporated into a street joke that Muammar Gaddafi really enjoys. This street joke equates Bunga Bunga with sex. Berlusconi hears this and goes, "You know what I'm going to call my weird parties? Bunga Bunga parties." Everyone involved in this story is the worst. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in just 1 week's time when we will look at an all-new historical myth. Before we go, I just want to remind everyone that we have our brand new patrons-only extra episode on the 7 wonders of the ancient world available now. The patrons really seem to be enjoying it. It's a mighty 2 hours and 11 minutes long, so if you need more Our Fake History in your life, then head to Patreon, start supporting at any level, and you will get access to that new extra. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me in many different ways. You can send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram, where you can see all the amazing episode art and all the videos I am making for the reels there. That's Instagram at ourfakehistory. You can find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. You can find me on YouTube at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. I am out there in the social media world if you want to interact with me. As always, the theme music for this show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.